The morning I discovered the jagged remains of my fence scattered across my once private yard, I realized the HOA had crossed a line they would soon regret. The sun was barely cresting the horizon, but already the neighborhood was alive with whispers and the faint rumble of lawnmowers, and there I stood, hands clenched, staring at splintered wood and torn posts that no amount of glue or screws could ever put back together, knowing full well that the people responsible for this destruction, fat, smug HOA board members led by the infamously entitled Karen, who strutted through the streets in heels 2 sizes too small, hair teased into an impossible puff, and a glare that could curdle milk, would expect me to meekly absorb the damage, apologize for my violation, and perhaps even pay a fine for daring to grow a row of tulips that peaked slightly over the arbitrary height limit she had enforced as though the world itself depended on her rules. But something in me snapped as I surveyed the ruin. I could see the faint tracks of her designer heels in the dirt, the crushed petals of my prize roses beneath, and my neighbor's children peeking from behind hedges with wide, horrified eyes, their phones already raised to capture evidence of my impending retaliation. And in that moment I swore that I would not rebuild as I had before, patching holes with cheap wood and hoping the HOA would leave me alone. No, this time I would build a fence that sent a message so clear it would echo across the cul-de-sac for years to come, a fence not just to protect my property but to assert dominion, a wooden wall of ingenuity and audacity that would slice through their manicured gardens like a declaration of war wrapped in the veneer of suburban civility, and the first step was designing it. Towering panels of reinforced cedar, posts sunk deep into the ground with concrete bases that would defy chainsaws, interlocking slats angled just so to create a visual statement of dominance, and the plan didn't end there. I would route it straight across the HOA's so-called community garden, the one they bragged about in newsletters as a symbol of neighborhood unity, a garden where every petunia, marigold, and neatly trimmed boxwood would become collateral in my rebellion, a living monument to my refusal to bow to arbitrary authority, and I began to sketch blueprints at my kitchen table, pencil scratching feverishly as the morning light spilled across pages cluttered with measurements, angles, and annotations about how each post would be numbered and leveled, how the panels would be staggered to maximize visual impact without technically violating zoning laws, and how the final installation would include subtle but undeniable flourishes that spoke to my control. Decorative spikes on the tops of posts, latticed inserts shaped like arrows pointing inward toward the demolished fence's former location, and even a small platform where I could stand to oversee the construction with satisfaction once the job was complete, all while Karen and her board members fumed helplessly from their porches, sipping lattes and mumbling curses I would never hear but could imagine perfectly in my mind's ear. And as I sourced materials from the local lumberyard, negotiating quietly with the manager who clearly sensed the storm I intended to unleash, I could feel the excitement building, the kind that comes from knowing that justice, or at least the satisfaction of watching those who think they can trample over others face consequences, was about to be served in the form of nail guns, concrete, and stubborn cedar posts. Trucks arrived early the next morning, dumping pallets of timber onto my driveway, each piece freshly cut, aromatic, and ready to be transformed into a monument of defiance, and I started with the foundation, digging holes with a rented auger, feeling the dirt crumble beneath the teeth of the drill, sweat running down my face despite the chill in the air, while neighborhood spectators, who had begun gathering in small clusters along the sidewalks, whispered among themselves, some taking bets on whether the fence would survive a week or if the HOA would call in lawyers immediately, but I didn't care about their doubts. The only opinion that mattered was mine, and it rang clear and strong with every swing of the post hole digger, every measured cut of timber, every calculated alignment of posts, and as I worked into the afternoon, positioning the first panels across what had once been Karen's perfect rows of begonias and impatiens, I felt an intoxicating sense of power. I was no longer the victim of petty bureaucracy and self-important rules. I was the architect of my own justice, the general of a wooden army that would stand proudly in the face of entitlement and arrogance. And when the first panel was secured, cutting a clean line through her prized garden beds, I paused to step back, wiping sweat from my brow, feeling a thrill run up my spine as her children peeked from behind her SUV, mouths agape, and her neighbors craned their necks, unsure whether to intervene or watch the spectacle unfold, and the sun began to dip, casting long shadows of my newly erected posts across the remnants of her once tended paradise, shadows that felt like the very embodiment of my triumph, and I knew this was only the beginning of a saga that would redefine the boundaries of suburban warfare, turning a simple fence rebuild into a story of audacity, cunning, and the kind of revenge that would be whispered about at HOA meetings for years to come. As I stood there surveying my creation, imagining the shocked expressions on Karen's face when she realized that I hadn't simply rebuilt. I had built a monument to defiance, a statement carved in cedar that my property, my rules, and my dignity were no longer negotiable. And that evening, as the last rays of sun glinted off nails hammered perfectly into place, I allowed myself a small, victorious smile, knowing that tomorrow, the true fun would begin when Karen, fat and furious, stepped outside to discover that her beloved garden had become the pathway for my unstoppable fence, a wooden declaration that the days of her petty tyranny over my land were officially over. The next morning, the neighborhood woke to a spectacle that would be remembered in whispered gossip and viral videos for months, if not years, as I stood at the edge of my yard, coffee in hand, surveying the fence that now ran like a defiant scar straight through Karen's manicured garden, her fat frame appearing in the distance as she waddled toward the scene with a mixture of fury and disbelief, clutching her phone as if ready to summon every authority she could think of. But the moment her eyes fell on the towering cedar panels, perfectly aligned, immovable, and slicing cleanly through the rows of impatiens and begonias she had spent hours fussing over, her breath caught and her cheeks flushed with the intensity of a wrath she couldn't yet channel, and I could see the flab on her arms trembling as she gestured wildly at the panels, screaming accusations of trespassing and destruction, while the HOA minions, her overweight and utterly ineffective deputies of so-called enforcement, stood behind her in awkward clusters, unsure whether to intervene or flee, and I knew that this was precisely the reaction I had envisioned, the perfect combination of shock, impotence, and helpless rage, because they had assumed I would simply rebuild, meekly apologize, and allow their petty rules to dictate my life, but they hadn't accounted for audacity, for the satisfaction that comes from turning their own tools of control into instruments of humiliation. And as the sun rose higher, casting sharp shadows across the mutilated flower beds, I decided it was time to escalate, not in violence but in sheer, unapologetic spectacle. So I climbed onto a small scaffold I had built for just this purpose, hammer in hand, and began attaching decorative lattice inserts shaped like jagged arrows pointing directly at the center of Karen's garden, each one a subtle yet unmistakable statement that my property was mine, that my fence was unassailable, and that her authority ended where my creativity and stubbornness began, while all around me, neighbors who had once whispered politely behind curtains now emerged, some snapping photos, others filming video with expressions that ranged from awe to amusement, and I realized that what had begun as a personal vendetta was transforming into a performance art of suburban rebellion, a cautionary tale written in cedar and concrete for anyone who thought rules, no matter how arbitrary, could stand unchallenged. And Karen, fat and red-faced, started pacing along the fence line, waving her arms and shouting threats that I couldn't hear over the sound of drills and hammers, but her intent was clear. She wanted to stop me, to assert dominance, to reclaim the garden she had meticulously curated as a showcase of her power, yet every action she took only underscored her futility, as posts were already sunk deep in concrete, panels interlocked so tightly they could not be dislodged without heavy machinery, and the lattice accents I had installed caught the sunlight, glinting like tiny spears that taunted her and made her fury seem almost comical in its intensity, and I felt a rush of satisfaction not from destruction but from the art of rebellion itself, the calculated, meticulous way I had turned a simple fence into a symbol of my autonomy, while Karen's neighbors began murmuring among themselves, some expressing admiration in hushed tones for my ingenuity, others shaking their heads at the chaos, and yet more simply, laughing openly at the absurdity of the spectacle. As Karen's protests grew louder, her voice hoarse from shouting, her body sweating, trembling, jiggling in a way that only amplified her ridiculousness, and I could see that the HOA's control over the neighborhood was crumbling not through force but through spectacle, through the undeniable visual dominance of my fence cutting across their utopian garden, creating a jagged line that was impossible to ignore, impossible to reclaim, and impossible to argue against without looking petty, vindictive, and utterly powerless, which of course was exactly what I wanted. And as I continued to work, adding final touches that would make removal next to impossible, angled crossbars, hidden metal brackets, reinforced posts sunk even deeper into the earth, I couldn't help but smile at the thought of Karen attempting to mobilize her board, sending emails, calling lawyers, demanding meetings, all while standing helplessly in front of a wall she couldn't cross, could barely touch, and would forever be reminded of every ounce of entitlement she had ever wielded over others. And the neighbors, sensing the shift in power, began to whisper excitedly among themselves, some daring to cheer softly, others daring to comment on how beautiful, audacious, and perfectly aligned the fence was, and I realized that what I had built was more than a fence. It was a statement, a monument, a masterclass in turning the tables on those who assumed their Wealth, their authority, and their self-importance can go unchallenged, and as the day stretched into evening, with Karen flopping down on her bench in her garden like a defeated matron, muttering curses under her breath, I began to plan the next stage of my revenge, subtle, psychological, and relentless, knowing that if the fence could stand as a daily reminder of their impotence, the next moves would cement the legend of the homeowner who refused to bow, the woman who rebuilt not just a fence, but a legacy of defiance, audacity, and suburban dominance, while all around me, the air buzzed with anticipation, whispers, camera clicks, and the faint scent of crushed flowers, a scent that was, in my mind, the perfume of victory. And as I finally stepped back to admire the full length of my creation stretching triumphantly across the neighborhood, I knew without a doubt that this was only the beginning, the first act in a performance that would crescendo over days, weeks, and months, leaving Karen, her board, and anyone who dared to challenge me with a lingering, undeniable lesson. Audacity, creativity, and meticulous planning will always trump entitlement, fat cat power trips, and petty rules, and the fence, slicing through her beloved garden like a monument to stubborn brilliance, was proof that I was no longer playing by their rules. I was writing the rules, one cedar post at a time. By the time the third day arrived, it was no longer just a fence. It had become a symbol of absolute defiance, a wooden scar cutting straight through Karen's meticulously curated garden, and I could hear the whispers of the neighborhood building into a low murmur of anticipation and speculation, because word had spread that the homeowner across the street, the one who had once politely waved at HOA meetings, paid fines on time, and kept her property impeccably clean, had transformed into a force of suburban reckoning, and Karen, fat and furious, had spent the night pacing her living room, plotting, calling the board, sending frantic texts to neighbors, and even threatening legal action she would be powerless to enforce, all while I stood in my yard before sunrise, a fresh cup of coffee in hand, surveying the smooth line of cedar panels that now cut through the remains of her garden like a sharp blade, sunlight catching the lattice inserts I had installed just so, glinting with tiny reflections that seemed to mock her attempts at control, and I felt a thrill surge through me at the thought that this was only the beginning. The first stage had been about shock, visibility, and audacity, but now it was time for psychological impact, for turning the HOA's sense of entitlement against itself in ways they couldn't anticipate, because the fence, while immovable, was also a canvas, a stage for subtle artistry and humiliation, and as I climbed onto my scaffold to inspect the alignment and adjust the decorative spikes so that they pointed in precise directions through her flower beds, I could see Karen emerging from her house, dragging her oversized frame across the lawn, her face flushed and glistening with sweat, clutching a clipboard and muttering incoherently about property lines, covenants, and negligent destruction, while her board members, overweight, awkward, and clearly out of their depth, followed, some with cell phones raised to document their so-called enforcement actions, and others simply staring in disbelief at the fence that had gone up with the speed, precision, and inevitability of fate itself. And I realized that the real power of my creation wasn't just its physical presence but the way it made the HOA look weak, ridiculous, and impotent, because for every foot of fence that cut through her garden, for every panel that stood perfectly aligned, for every lattice arrow glinting in the morning sun, Karen's credibility and aura of control diminished, leaving her to fume, scream, and attempt negotiation from a position of zero leverage, while I remained calm, methodical, and utterly in control, surveying the scene like a general inspecting a battlefield. And as I descended from the scaffold to hammer the final post into place, I could hear the faint snapping of twigs under her feet as she approached, each step seeming heavier, more desperate, more futile, and I smirked at the thought that the garden she had cultivated for years, her pride, her display of authority, her so-called community masterpiece, was now collateral in a performance that she had no control over, while neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the spectacle, some cheering quietly, some whispering their admiration, others simply filming on phones, capturing footage that would inevitably circulate through neighborhood groups, social media, and private chats, cementing the legend of the homeowner who refused to bow. And I decided it was time to introduce a new element, subtle, theatrical embellishments that would elevate the fence from mere structure to psychological weapon. So I began attaching small solar-powered lanterns along the top of each panel, spaced evenly, casting a soft glow across the ruined garden at night, a reminder that my presence, my ingenuity, and my audacity would not fade when the sun set. And I imagined Karen stepping outside in the early evening, hoping to confront me under the cover of dusk, only to be confronted instead by the fence lit like a silent, mocking sentinel, casting elongated shadows across what had once been her pride and joy. And I could see her fat, trembling hands gripping the edges of her clipboard as her board members looked on helplessly, unable to advise, intervene, or undo what I had accomplished, and the children of the neighborhood, who had initially peeked from behind hedges in wide-eyed curiosity, now ran along the sidewalk, filming, laughing, and whispering excitedly about the audacity of the fence, while I worked methodically, adjusting, aligning, and reinforcing each panel, ensuring that it would withstand not only legal threats, attempts at removal or natural elements but also the psychological warfare I intended to wage. And as I stepped back, wiping sweat from my brow, surveying the perfectly straight line of cedar that cut through flower beds, crushed rose bushes, and every ornamental shrub Karen had tended, I felt a surge of satisfaction that bordered on euphoric, because the fence wasn't just a fence, it was a statement, a manifesto, a work of tactical brilliance that communicated far more than words ever could, and I knew that in the days to come Karen's every move would be dictated by my fence. Her anger, her meetings, her futile legal threats, all choreographed by the wooden monument I had erected, and as I began planning further embellishments, tiny plaques with cheeky inscriptions, small decorative spikes subtly shaped like arrows pointing directly at her lawn ornaments, a miniature platform for me to stand upon for maximum visibility, I could feel the thrill of anticipation building, the intoxicating knowledge that I had seized control of not only my property but the narrative, turning a simple act of construction into an unstoppable force of audacity. And as the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the crushed petals and disrupted soil, I stepped back one last time for the day, breathing deeply, feeling the cool evening air on my skin, and knew that tomorrow, Karen would awaken to a scene she could neither undo nor ignore, and that the fence, straight, imposing, and unapologetically audacious, would serve as a daily reminder that in the battle of homeowner versus HOA, preparation, vision, and a willingness to defy convention were all the weapons one truly needed, while the neighborhood watched, whispered, recorded, and marveled at the spectacle, and I smiled already, imagining the escalating chaos that would unfold in the days to come, knowing without a doubt that I had not only reclaimed my property but also rewritten the rules of engagement in a quiet suburban war that would be told in hushed tones for years to come. The morning light spilled across the neighborhood, illuminating the fence I had built like a scar of audacity slicing through Karen's once pristine garden, and as I stepped onto my front porch, the sight of her fat, fuming figure huffing across the lawn like an enraged bull made my chest tighten with a combination of triumph and anticipation, because this was no longer just a fence, it was a statement, a challenge, a psychological strike against entitlement itself, and I could see her board members trailing behind her, their own bulk and ineptitude making them look like a slow, useless parade of impotence, while she waved her oversized arms, shouting threats, citations, and accusations in a voice hoarse with fury and disbelief, clearly hoping that volume alone could intimidate me into submission. But the truth was far more satisfying than any legal battle or heated argument. I had created a masterpiece of rebellion, a wooden monolith that was immovable, visually commanding, and psychologically devastating, stretching across her beloved flower beds, crushing the carefully arranged begonias, tulips, and impatiens, leaving a wake of shattered petals and flattened soil that would serve as daily reminders of her failure to control me. And as I walked slowly toward the fence, measuring panels and tightening bolts, I could see the exact moment she realized that shouting was useless, that threats were powerless, that the law, bureaucracy, and HOA authority had no leverage over someone who had thought 3 steps ahead, anticipated every complaint, every attempt at removal, and accounted for every loophole in zoning, construction, and property lines, because the posts were sunk deep in concrete, interlocking panels reinforced with hidden brackets, and lattice inserts angled in a way that allowed maximum visual impact while technically staying within municipal codes, and I could feel the thrill of mastery coursing through me as I realized that this was more than revenge. It was performance art, tactical theater, and suburban warfare rolled into one, a spectacle that neighbors gathered to watch from porches, driveways, and sidewalks, some whispering in awe, others laughing, some recording video on their phones, and even children who had peeked from behind hedges days earlier now ran freely along the street, narrating the scene like a play-by-play of defiance, while Karen's attempts at negotiation became increasingly desperate, her fat frame leaning over her clipboard, her fingers trembling as she scribbled notes, made phone calls, and gestured furiously at me, trying to assert authority, and I knew she would fail because the fence was more than wood and nails, it was strategy, calculation, and relentless audacity, and I began to add final touches to solidify the psychological impact. Small solar-powered lanterns that illuminated each panel at night, spikes carefully angled to appear menacing without violating safety codes, and decorative latticework shaped like arrows pointing directly at her most prized plants, creating a visual metaphor for dominance and control. And as I climbed the scaffold to inspect alignment and symmetry, I could see Karen's expressions shift from rage to helplessness, to something almost resembling fear, as if the realization had finally struck that her authority had been rendered irrelevant by simple materials, careful planning, and a refusal to back down, while the neighborhood buzzed with excitement. Whispers and the faint clicks of cameras, and I knew that every hour, every sunbeam that caught the spikes, every shadow cast across the flattened garden beds, would compound her frustration, slowly but surely breaking her aura of command, making her look petty, foolish, and utterly powerless. And I began thinking ahead, plotting subtle embellishments, tiny signs, and cheeky plaques that would leave the message permanent, visible, and undeniable to anyone who walked past while Karen's board members, overweight, muttering, and unsure, hovered at the perimeter, clearly incapable of organizing, enforcing, or countering my work in any meaningful way, because the fence had turned the dynamic on its head. I was in control, dictating the visual and psychological narrative, while they could only react helplessly, absurdly, and futilely. And as I stepped back to survey the full expanse, the sun highlighting the perfectly straight line cutting through her pride and joy, I felt a surge of satisfaction that went beyond revenge. This was the artistry of control, of turning the tables, of making the entitled powerless before meticulous planning and audacious execution. And I could see the first glimmers of her panic set in, the fat jiggling arms shaking, eyes narrowing in disbelief, lips pressed together as if to hold back curses. While I already envisioned the conversations she would have with neighbors, the frantic calls to lawyers, the desperate pleadings to enforce rules that had no real teeth, and I knew they would accomplish nothing, because every inch of the fence was deliberate, every shadow cast was a reminder, every crushed flower an unspoken message. And as the day stretched on, I continued to add details, strengthening panels, reinforcing brackets, installing angled lattice accents, and placing lanterns that caught the sunlight during the day and glowed softly at night, ensuring that my creation would dominate visually, psychologically, and symbolically. And as I finally descended the scaffold, wiping sweat from my brow, surveying the spectacle that was now both my property line and Karen's humiliation, I could see the neighborhood's fascination growing, whispers circulating, phones snapping, and a sense of awe building, because what I had constructed was no longer merely a fence. It was legend in the making, a testament to patience, foresight, and the audacity to fight back, a living monument that would stand as a daily reminder that entitlement, fat arrogance, and HOA authority could be rendered powerless by careful planning, unflinching confidence, and the will to act boldly. And as the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across crushed petals and disrupted soil, I allowed myself a private, victorious smile, knowing that the battle had only begun, but the first wave had been delivered perfectly, elegantly, and ruthlessly, with the kind of precision that would be remembered by Karen, her board, and anyone who witnessed the spectacle for years to come. The morning air carried a tension unlike anything the neighborhood had ever experienced, the kind of charged silence that precedes either disaster or triumph. And I stepped onto my porch, surveying the fence that now cut like a jagged scar through Karen's prized garden, the first rays of sun glinting off the decorative lattice spikes I had installed with meticulous precision, and I could see Karen waddling toward the scene, fat and furious, her oversized frame quivering with barely contained rage, her face flushed a deep shade of crimson as she clutched her clipboard and muttered incoherently about property lines, fines, and the outrageous destruction she insisted had occurred overnight, while her board members, overweight, awkward, and completely unprepared, shuffled behind her, muttering to one another, clearly hoping for guidance they could not provide. And the sight filled me with a thrill that coursed through my veins like electricity, because this was no longer simply a dispute about property or rules. It had evolved into a spectacle of audacity, strategy, and carefully measured psychological warfare, a performance designed to assert dominance without the need for confrontation. Yet the impact was immediate, palpable, and devastating to the HOA's fragile authority, and as I approached the fence, hammer in hand, I began adding subtle embellishments that would further unsettle Karen, placing tiny plaques with cheeky inscriptions along the panels, each one positioned so that she would see it at eye level, reading messages that mocked her arrogance and celebrated my defiance, while the sun climbed higher, casting long dramatic shadows across the crushed flower beds and shattered petals, shadows that seemed to emphasize the absolute authority of the wooden barrier I had erected. And as neighbors began to emerge from their homes, drawn by the spectacle, some filming, some whispering, some pointing excitedly at details they had never noticed before, the energy in the street shifted from curiosity to awe, because the fence was more than just a structure. It was a statement, a carefully orchestrated manifestation of power, strategy, and brilliance that transformed the suburban landscape into a stage where I was the director, choreographing reactions, emotions, and perceptions with every angled panel, reinforced post, and glinting spike. While Karen's attempts at negotiation devolved into absurdity, her fat frame leaning over the fence in vain, gesturing wildly, her words tumbling out in a torrent of frustration, and I could see the first cracks forming in her confidence, the realization that no matter how loud she shouted, no matter how many fines she imagined, no matter how many board meetings she convened, the fence was immovable, unyielding, and undeniably mine, because every post was sunk deep in concrete, every panel interlocked with precision, every decorative element carefully calculated to maximize psychological impact, while remaining perfectly legal, and the neighborhood watched in rapt attention as she flailed, realizing that their once dreaded HOA leader was powerless against a homeowner who had planned, anticipated, and executed with ruthless effectiveness, and I could feel the adrenaline pumping through me as I moved along the fence line, inspecting each panel, tightening bolts, adjusting lattice accents, and imagining the internal meltdown occurring in Karen's mind, the combination of fury, humiliation, and helplessness that would define her next weeks, months, and possibly years. And as I climbed the scaffold to install a few final lanterns that would glow softly at night, casting eerie, deliberate shadows across the crushed gardens, I envisioned her stepping outside at dusk, expecting to intimidate or negotiate, only to be confronted by a glowing monument to my audacity, my preparation, and my refusal to bow, while the neighborhood children ran along the sidewalk, filming, narrating, and laughing with wide-eyed glee at the spectacle of the fat HOA matron reduced to impotent rage. And I realized with a deep, satisfying thrill that every small detail mattered. The perfect straightness of the panels, the symmetry of the lattice, the shadows cast by each spike, the subtle tilt of the plaques, all combining to create a performance piece that conveyed dominance without a single word spoken, yet screamed volumes to anyone who saw it, including Karen, who now stood frozen in disbelief. Fat arms shaking, forehead glistening with sweat, muttering threats that I couldn't even begin to hear, while her board members exchanged nervous glances, realizing that the enforcement powers they had wielded so confidently for years were now irrelevant, powerless, and laughably insufficient. And I knew that the true victory was not in the fence itself but in the psychological leverage it provided, the subtle but undeniable reminder that I was in control, dictating the narrative, shaping perceptions, and asserting authority in a way that no amount of petty HOA rules could counter. And as I finally descended the scaffold, surveying the full length of the fence bathed in sunlight, casting jagged shadows across her flattened garden, I felt a surge of triumph that was almost euphoric, because this was more than a revenge story. It was a masterclass in audacity, planning, and execution, a living testament to what could be achieved when creativity, courage, and meticulous preparation were applied to right the wrongs of entitlement and arrogance. While Karen, fat, furious, and utterly defeated, slumped against her own lawn, realizing that she could neither remove, undo, nor reclaim anything I had built, and the whispers, giggles, and camera clicks of the neighborhood served as a soundtrack to her humiliation, reminding everyone that in the quiet suburbs, boldness and foresight would always trump fat arrogance and petty authority. And as I stepped back to admire my creation, envisioning future embellishments, nightly illuminations, and small symbolic touches that would continue to torment the HOA psychologically, I knew beyond a doubt that this was a battle I had already won, not with violence or law, but with the power of audacity, precision, and relentless creativity, and the legend of the homeowner who built a fence straight through the HOA's garden was only beginning to take hold, destined to echo through the cul-de-sac and neighborhood for years to come. The sun had barely risen when I stepped into my yard, the air crisp and filled with the scent of crushed flowers and freshly cut cedar, and I immediately spotted Karen, fat, flustered, and furious, waddling across the street toward my fence like a storm cloud incarnate, her oversized arms flailing, phone clutched tightly in one hand as she attempted to summon some semblance of authority, while her board members, overweight, awkward, and entirely ineffective, shuffled behind her like a parade of incompetence, muttering about bylaws, violations, and fines they were too cowardly to enforce. And I felt a thrill surge through me because today, the stakes had escalated beyond simple revenge or humiliation. This was a full-scale psychological siege, and the fence I had built was the spearhead of a campaign that would leave the HOA reeling in its wake, a monument of audacity and precision that cut straight through Karen's beloved garden with a cold, deliberate clarity, the lattice arrows pointing inward like accusatory fingers, the solar lanterns glinting in the morning sun like tiny beacons of unstoppable resolve, and as I began walking the length of the panels, inspecting alignment, tightening bolts, and making minor adjustments to the latticework for maximum intimidation effect, I could see Karen's face fluctuate between rage, disbelief, and the creeping realization that she was utterly powerless, that every ounce of authority she had ever wielded, every rule she had enforced, every threat she had made, was meaningless in the presence of someone who had planned 3 steps ahead, anticipated every loophole, and executed a masterpiece of audacious defiance. While the neighbors gathered along sidewalks, porches, and driveways, cameras raised, whispers turning into excited murmurs as they watched the spectacle unfold, some cheering quietly, others laughing outright, children running along the street narrating the events with glee, and I could feel the energy of their attention feeding my own confidence, because the fence had become more than wood and nails. It was a performance, a psychological weapon, and a carefully crafted declaration that the days of entitlement, arrogance, and petty rules were over, and I knew it wasn't enough to simply stand by and let the HOA stew in frustration. No, the next stage required subtle theatrics, a layering of humiliation and dominance that would leave a permanent impression. So I climbed the scaffold, adjusting the top panels with care, installing additional decorative spikes that glinted like teeth in the sunlight, angled precisely to catch Karen's gaze from every point she might approach, while my mind raced with plans for subtle, symbolic touches. Small plaques with cheeky inscriptions, solar lanterns that would glow ominously at night, and lattice inserts designed to create shadows that would appear to point directly at her fat, trembling frame, all designed to remind her, constantly and unavoidably, that control had shifted irrevocably. And as I descended from the scaffold, wiping sweat from my brow, Karen finally lunged forward, flab jiggling with fury, shaking her clipboard like a weapon, shouting threats that were rendered meaningless by the sheer audacity of the fence and the precision of its construction. And I felt a rush of satisfaction as I calmly raised a hand, indicating that I was listening, nodding politely, while her words bounced off the reinforced cedar and vanished into the warm morning air, leaving her looking more ridiculous with each passing second. And I knew the performance was working perfectly, because even her board members, the supposed enforcers of neighborhood rules, began to fidget, mutter, and exchange helpless glances, realizing that the power dynamic had shifted entirely, that they were now mere spectators in a drama where I held all the cards, while Karen, fat, furious, and flustered, stepped back and tried to organize a more coordinated assault. But I had anticipated this, reinforcing posts, interlocking panels, and decorative lattice in ways that made removal or tampering impossible without heavy machinery and professional intervention, all while maintaining perfect legality, because the satisfaction of watching her futile efforts was heightened by the knowledge that no law, no threat, no fine could undo the audacity I had unleashed, and the neighborhood buzzed with excitement, whispers, and phone clicks, documenting the spectacle as it unfolded, children laughing, adults murmuring about the brilliance, creativity, and sheer courage it had taken to execute such a plan. And I realized that what I had built was now legendary in its own right, a fence not merely as a boundary but as a monument to the audacity, intelligence, and unstoppable determination of a homeowner who refused to bow. And as the day progressed, I began adding final, subtle embellishments, tiny solar lanterns along the top casting eerie glows, lattice inserts angled to catch sunlight and create shadows like accusatory fingers, small plaques with cheeky inscriptions visible only from certain angles, each element carefully designed to reinforce the psychological dominance I had achieved, while Karen's flustered, fat frame lurched back and forth along the perimeter, trying desperately to assess damage, rally her board, and assert authority that no longer existed. And I could see the creeping sense of helplessness in her eyes, the slow realization that every threat, every complaint, every attempt to enforce HOA rules had been nullified by foresight, precision, and relentless audacity, while the neighborhood whispered, filmed, and laughed quietly, capturing moments that would become stories repeated at block parties, HOA meetings, and private chats for years to come. And I felt a surge of pride, because this wasn't just a fence. It was a carefully orchestrated campaign of domination, a statement that declared, in no uncertain terms, that entitlement, fat arrogance, and petty authority could be dismantled through preparation, creativity, and audacity. And as the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long dramatic shadows across the crushed flower beds, flattened roses, and trampled impatience, I stepped back, surveying my creation in all its glory, knowing that the battle had been won in every way that mattered. The HOA's authority was impotent, Karen's rage was impotent, her board's coordination was impotent, and I, standing victorious in the center of my yard, had proven that vision, audacity, and careful execution were more powerful then bureaucracy, fat arrogance, or the illusion of control, while the neighborhood cheered quietly from a distance, some capturing footage, some laughing openly, and children darting along the sidewalks like excited witnesses to a legendary victory, and I smiled, already planning the subtle, lingering touches that would ensure Karen and her board would be reminded of this day every time they dared to step outside, because the fence was more than a boundary, it was a psychological monument, a statement of dominance, a carefully constructed reminder that audacity always wins, and as evening fell, the solar lanterns glinted faintly, the lattice shadows stretched ominously across the garden, and I knew with absolute certainty that the HOA had been defeated not by confrontation, not by law, not by threat, but by vision, creativity, and the relentless will to act boldly, and the legend of the homeowner who built a fence straight through the HOA's garden would echo through the cul-de-sac. 4 years to come, immortalized in whispers, photographs, and the memory of Karen, fat, furious, and utterly powerless, standing before her ruined paradise. By the 7th day, the neighborhood had transformed into a stage for a spectacle that could only be described as legendary, with the fence I had built standing like a towering monument of audacity and calculated defiance, slicing cleanly through Karen's once pristine garden, the morning sun catching the lattice arrows I had installed with painstaking precision, casting jagged shadows across the crushed rose bushes, flattened tulips, and trampled begonias, and I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, heart pounding with anticipation, because today was the culmination of a week-long campaign of psychological warfare, strategic planning, and carefully orchestrated humiliation, and I could see Karen, fat and furious, waddling across the street like a storm cloud incarnate, her oversized arms flailing as she attempted to summon authority she no longer possessed, her board members, overweight, inept, and utterly powerless, trailing behind her muttering helplessly about fines, covenants, and bylaws that were meaningless in the face of a homeowner who had thought 5, 10, 15 steps ahead, anticipating every complaint, every countermeasure, every desperate move they could muster, and the sight filled me with a thrill so intense it was almost intoxicating, because this was no longer a dispute over property. It had evolved into a full-scale performance of dominance, strategy, and audacious control, and as I walked the length of the fence, inspecting panels, tightening bolts, adjusting lattice angles, and ensuring that every decorative spike caught the sunlight in a way that would maximize psychological impact, I could see the slow, almost imperceptible unraveling of Karen's composure, the subtle twitching of her jiggling arms, the tremor in her fat, flustered hands, the glint of helplessness in her eyes, and I knew that every panel, every post, every angled lattice insert was working exactly as intended, because the fence was more than wood and nails, it was a weapon, a monument, a living, breathing testament to planning, foresight, and audacity, and as neighbors emerged from homes, driveways, and porches, whispering, filming, and laughing quietly at the absurdity of a fat HOA matron reduced to impotent rage, I began adding final embellishments that would solidify the psychological domination, attaching small solar-powered lanterns that would glow softly at night, installing miniature plaques with cheeky inscriptions visible only from certain angles, and adjusting lattice inserts to cast shadows that pointed directly at her most prized garden ornaments, creating an unavoidable visual reminder of her failure to control me, while she stomped along the perimeter, fat, furious, and increasingly desperate, muttering threats that I could barely hear, her voice hoarse from a week of yelling, shaking her clipboard like a weapon against the inevitable, and I felt a surge of triumph knowing that every ounce of her entitlement, every arrogant assumption she had ever held about HOA power, every expectation that her will alone could bend reality had been obliterated by careful preparation and relentless audacity, while the neighborhood children ran along the sidewalks filming, narrating, and laughing, and adults whispered their admiration, some daring to cheer quietly, and the spectacle had reached such intensity that every neighbor within sight had paused their morning routines to witness the drama, as Karen's board members, overweight, muttering, and confused, realized that they were utterly powerless, that the rules they enforced had been rendered meaningless by foresight, skill, and psychological precision, and I continued my work, adjusting, reinforcing, and perfecting every detail, knowing that each action further cemented my control, each spike, lattice angle, and panel alignment was a calculated move in a game they could not win, and as the sun climbed higher, highlighting the absolute dominance of the fence over her once pristine garden, I began to imagine the escalation that would unfold in days to come, subtle, theatrical, and devastating, because while the fence was immovable and visually commanding, the real victory lay in the psychological impact, the daily reminder that Karen and her board had no power over me, that their rules, fines, and threats were impotent, and that their authority had been dismantled by audacity, creativity, and meticulous planning. And as I stepped back to survey the full expanse, the shadows stretching long across flattened roses, crushed tulips, and trampled begonias, I could see the unmistakable realization settling over her fat, flustered frame, the dawning knowledge that the battle had already been lost. While the neighborhood watched, whispered, filmed, and laughed quietly, children running excitedly along the sidewalks, capturing footage that would inevitably circulate through social media, private chats, and block party conversations for months to come, cementing the legend of the homeowner who refused to bow. And I felt an intoxicating mix of satisfaction, triumph, and adrenaline, because this was not mere revenge. It was a calculated, strategic, psychological campaign executed flawlessly, a masterclass in suburban dominance and audacious creativity. And I knew that Karen, fat, furious, and utterly powerless, would spend weeks, months, and possibly years replaying these events in her mind, feeling the sting of humiliation, helplessness, and defeat, while the fence, standing tall, straight, and perfectly aligned, glinted in the sunlight, casting shadows like accusatory fingers, illuminated by solar lanterns, adorned with lattice arrows, plaques, and subtle artistic flourishes, and serving as a permanent monument to my triumph, audacity, and refusal to be intimidated, while the neighborhood whispered, filmed, and laughed, witnessing the irreversible shift in power dynamics. And as I finally stepped back, surveying my creation in all its glory, every detail meticulously planned, every psychological impact considered, I could feel a deep, satisfying sense of victory wash over me, because this was more than a fence. It was a legend in the making, a living testament to foresight, courage, and the undeniable power of audacity. And the story of the homeowner who built a fence straight through the HOA's garden would echo through the cul-de-sac for years to come, immortalized in whispers, photographs, and the memory of Karen, fat, furious, and utterly defeated, standing before her ruined paradise. While the children ran along the sidewalks, the adults whispered in awe, and I, calm, victorious, and unshakable, knew beyond a shadow of a doubt that the HOA had been crushed not by force, law, or argument, but by vision, meticulous planning, and the relentless will to act boldly and creatively, turning what had begun as a simple fence rebuild into an epic tale of suburban audacity, humiliation, and undeniable triumph that would be remembered and retold for generations. By the end of the week, the fence stood tall and unchallenged, a perfectly straight, audacious line cutting through Karen's garden, solar lanterns glinting, lattice arrows casting tiny accusatory shadows, and small plaques mocking her every assumption, while she, fat, flustered, and utterly powerless, stomped along the perimeter, muttering threats that carried no weight, her board members looking on helplessly, realizing that every ounce of their authority had been dismantled by preparation, foresight, and sheer audacity. And as neighbors watched, whispered, and filmed the spectacle, children running excitedly along the sidewalks, I finally stepped back, surveying the result of a week's labor, the ultimate statement of dominance, creativity, and psychological victory, knowing that the HOA had been humiliated, that Karen's arrogance had been crushed, and that my property, my rules, and my dignity were now unassailable, leaving the cul-de-sac buzzing with stories of the legendary homeowner who had built a fence straight through the HOA's garden and won.